The ACT reading section, out of all the ACT sections that I coach, is actually a really easy section to push into the 30s consistently. What I have filmed is a walkthrough of a single passage on this test. I am trained formally through the ACT and I actively take the new version of the ACT. So I hope you find this video helpful, and this is a full map out of a passage. Enjoy. Hi, I'm Rebecca Beard. I own Niceville Tutoring, which we cover subjects K through 12 with an emphasis on test prep. We have over 45 teachers on staff who support students online and in person. If you're looking for some support, we have our link in the description below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with study tips and tricks. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to walk through a passage, and this is what I commonly do with one-on-one students. This is like a medium level passage, and I'm going to show exactly how I would map it out and then actually answer some of the questions together. This one, if you have the red book, is also found in the first, I believe it's the first practice test on the second passage. This was a screenshot from the training, but there's a lot of overlap since it's a newer version of the test and they don't have as many resources. Okay, so that all being said, so kind of key things that we need to know before we get jumping in is that when you do this ACT reading, the enhanced, since it's new, one key thing to know is what is also a blessing, and I'm going to scroll down just a little bit so you can see my screen, is that it used to be 9 minutes per 9 minutes per 10 questions, which is crazy. Now they've gotten, oh, it's so much better. They now have 10 minutes per passage. So 10 minutes per passage with 9 questions. That is the beauty of this. Okay, so here is the downside. There is one passage that is not graded. One thing they said in the training very specifically is that it's never the first skipped or not graded. I don't know if I would hold to that. My rule of thumb, and actually even the old way, my rule of thumb is you want to get to all the passages as possible. And the way you do that is to actually practice your timing. Some of the ACT strategies that they preach, and I'll share them with you. And then I'm going to also share what I'm seeing actually like effectively work with students. So let's go ahead and scroll up a little bit. So the ACT strategies that were provided during this training, and I'm going to save you guys about 12 hours of long training. That was not cheap either. So the key ACT strategies, big shock, read the passage. It was kind of funny that they mentioned it in all honesty, because I was like, well, that's obvious. But here's their thing, is they're really against people not reading the passage and going straight to the questions. Here's where I disagree. I have coached so many dang students in classes and one-on-ones, you name it. And a lot of them, even with the new timing, still struggle to finish reading the passage and answer all the questions. And heck, I'm the same way. I have slowed down, sadly, with age with my reading, and that applies to kids too. So their big rule of thumb for the ACT is to read the passage and then go to the questions. They say in order, out of order, it doesn't really matter, but that's their big thing. And they're really big on annotating the passage. That was one of their nuggets that they shared, which I think is not a bad nugget. They talked about road mapping, where you're like adding line numbers of each question, which can work really well, but I find it only works on my students really well who have, one, that are speed readers, which I've worked with those, and then 2, have time and a half or double time accommodations. This is what I actually see work in real life. So I say kind of one of 2 things is reading either the first and last paragraph. And then the other thing that I like to do is read the first half and then go to what I say the easy questions, and I'm going to highlight those. I've had kids get into deep in the 30s, like a 33, without reading a single passage. What they did is they started with the questions that are easiest and go back and forth. That's what they preferred. That's what had the most amount of accuracy for them. It sounds really weird, but honestly, I've had one of my favorite reading classes. Actually, I had 2 kids compete per passage to see if one read it and one didn't read it, because they were scoring really equally, and who did better. And it was actually consistently the kid who didn't read the passage, which was kind of entertaining a little little anecdotal, but still very entertaining at the time. So, but that just kind of proves the point. Like, you don't have to be married to reading the passage. So that all being said, one like little nugget that they did throw in there that I thought was really, I don't know, that was kind of interesting, and I hadn't heard before, is that the passages with line numbers, like a ton of line numbers, all of them tend to have it. The more line numbers, the harder the passage. So all that I mean by that is when there's more line numbers, it means the harder the reading level, and the reading levels vary from early high school all the way into they call it pre-college or like college level. Normally the third passage, like anecdotally for me, third passage equals the SAD scores. So that one is actually going to be normally where the kids bomb, because there's 4 different types of passages. So whenever a kid is scrambling on time, I say do this one last and get the most bang for your buck. Okay, so that's like some general reading strategies. Apologize for my Apple Pencil writing. I'm learning how to use an Apple Pencil. We're working on it, so thank you for bearing with me. So let's go ahead and actually go to this passage. So this passage I've coached through a few times. Would I say it's my favorite one in the world? Absolutely not. But the reason I chose it is it really does a good combination of kind of like a good mid-level, and it's got tons of strategies in it that I like to work on with kids. So the first thing that I do, and I do this in classes or whatever, like one-on-ones, is I set a 90-second. And the reason I do that, I say, okay, both me and you are going to read this passage, but I tell them time and time again that it's okay if you don't finish. And the reason that it's okay is because we're going to go back. It's an open book test. But here is what you need to think of during those 90 seconds. So during those 90 seconds, you need to read, but not close read. I kind of call it like a mid read. There's skimming, which is like, just getting the gist. Then there's like a middle read. That's kind of a made up word, but what I mean is like you're generally going along and reading. And then a close read is when you're like annotating, highlighting, all that stuff. And that you don't have time for unless you have double time, which if you have double time, you actually need that time truly. Okay, so that being said, on that note, like I said, 90 seconds. 90 seconds is kind of the sweet spot where kids can get enough of a gist. They're likely not going to finish it. I have exceptions. But it saves plenty of time for questions. If you start going into like the 2-minute range, I find those kids, like if they take the whole 2 minutes to read the passage, by the time they get to the questions, 9 times out of 10, they forgot the passages. And then another common thing that I see too, and I want to highlight, is kids actually reading all the questions before they go to the passage. God bless, please don't do that. I'm going to explain how to do that in just a second. So if you're watching this is a good time to pause, set a 90-second timer, and then read the passage, and then stop. Okay, we're going to pretend like you did the timer. I did not, because I've read this passage, actually, I think this week with another kid, because I like this one's a really good one to walk through. Okay, so what we did, we went through the informational passage. It's about tulips. It's a little bit boring, but that's okay. So as we're going into the passage, this is what I do. On number 10 that I see right there, the main purpose of the passage is to, whenever I see the words main, I say, hold off, we're going to go back here later. So we can look, we can highlight it, we can put a little star. Okay, so I am going to go on a hunt for the easiest questions. So I am moving my iPad. And so what I would say, and this sounds like a little childlike, but it's kind of true, is I always start with the ones with the least amount of words on the easiest questions. It builds up the confidence, it gets context, but that seems to be kind of the sweet spot. So our magic one on this one is number 18. So used in line and in most nearly means. And so this is how you do these like terms and context. What I suggest with students is actually like not directly going to the answers first, but going directly to 80. And then on 80, let's see where it is. So it's just a touch of abandon. That's the word. And then I say read at least like a sentence above, sentence below, and as you go through it, and I'll model that. So color breaks when they did occur, where
promptly destroyed, and a certain peculiar manifestation of natural beauty abruptly lost its claim on human affection. I can't help thinking that the virus was supplying something that the tulip needed, just a touch of abandon. The flower's chilly formality called for. Maybe that's why the tulip became, a broken tulip became such a treasure in the 17th century Holland. Okay, so if I was going to sub out a word abandon of my own choosing, I got to think through this. So, with supplying with just a touch of abandon, the flower's chilly formality called for. So, maybe a touch of change. That might be like kind of a good starting word. So let's kind of go through these, and change might not perfectly match, but it kind of shows that I know a little bit what's going on in the context. So on 18, abandon most nearly means, so retreat and denial, those ones your flower can't be denying, so we remove that. Retreat, no, because you're going backwards. And then relinquish. See, relinquish is like let go, just a touch of let go. And that's not it. And so the answer on this one is uninhibitedness. And so most kids actually don't know what this word means. I found, and maybe you do if you're watching this, but it just means to be like, inhibited means to be restricted, and uninhibited means to be like unrestrictive. I always think of it as my 4-year-old who has no care in the world and just constantly sings crazy songs, and that's being uninhibited. Okay, so let's kind of start working backwards of how we like tactically go through these other questions. So number 17, the passage author most likely mentions that the peach trees were a staple of 17th century gardens too. So what we have to do is we have to go back to this passage. So the most likely mentions that peach trees were a staple of 7th century gardens too. So the ACT is a super literal test. So we are literally going to be looking for that in context. You're going to see my little name move around. It's because on my iPad, I have it super zoomed in. Okay, so what you're looking for here is line items that pretty much mention what's going on in the 17th century. It wasn't until the 1920s. Okay, so it's discussing, works particularly recognized, suppressing and metromycin wasn't until the 1920s, tulip by that. So you've got peach trees mentioned here. So that's not quite where we're is we go back to some other ones. So what you're looking for is key things on peach trees. So this one right here, it mentions the peach trees, and that's the only spot. So as going back to it, it talks about the peach trees similar to the tulips had a virus. So if you go to 17, the best way to internally answer where staple of century gardens to compare tulips and other popular 7th century crop to explain how peach potato aphid spread the tulip virus. So this one would be C because that's the only thing that's talking about. And then on 16, in the passage, the author compares broken tulips as they are represented in Rembrandt's paintings too. So this is where this one a lot of kids miss really quickly. So as you're looking through this, you start looking in these lines. And the way you do it in real life is you're skimming as you go, looking for these key words here. And so we're talking about name because Rembrandt painted the most admired breaks of the time, but these latter-day tulips were with their heavy patterning of one or more contrasting color look like a clumsy in comparison. So this is where most students stumble, as if painted in haste. So the key that you have to ask yourself is the author compares broken tulips as they are represented. So broken tulips in this passage is good. Rembrandt is good. And then what they're highlighting in comparison is today's tulips that are, in this author's eyes, bad. So knowing that, let's go to 16. So on 16 here, he compares them to peach tree blossoms, paint powders spread on the ground, painting hastily with a thick brush. That was mentioned, but it's not comparing. And then intricately marbleized papers. That matches what the context is going on, but it's also mentioned in, as you skim down a little bit, were originals as fine, intricate as marbleized papers. There's a little bit of distractors in there, but this is where it's highlighting. So this is kind of going on very, very literal. Okay, so now on 15, according to the passage in the 17th century, in fact, that broken tulips tend to produce fewer and smaller offsets compared to typical bulbs resulted in. So this one, they're seeing what happened with all these broken tulips, what happened. And kind of a hint, a lot of stuff can be in the first paragraph. So that being said, if you look right here at the sentence, the fact that the broken tulips for some unknown reason produced fewer and fewer smaller offsets than ordinary tulips drove their prices still higher. So what happens is those fancy tulips, the prices are going to increase. And then let's go to our options. A decrease, a fear, disease, that wasn't discussed. It was discussed, but they didn't realize why till later. An increase, a desire to plant a wide variety. So this is the only one that's relative. Okay, on number 14, the sixth paragraph, lines 79 through 85, differs from the rest of the passage in that so we've got 79 through 85. So let's go ahead and look at it. So this whole thing before is kind of a discussion on like what's going on, and a little bit, it's supposed to be more of a historical account. What is kind of unique here is it starts out with I thinking that the virus, which wasn't used in the rest of the passage. Treasure of its face of the story, the virus in the tulip would seem to throw a wrench into an evolutionary understanding of beauty. So this one is personal. So let's go over here to number 14. And on 14, we want to find something that marks personal. And questions whether virus that caused, nope. Argues that the growers should have dealt with the broken tulips differently, nope. Challenges the idea that the broken tulips were beautiful. Presents a personal meditation. Yep, there's the word personal because of I. Couple more, and then we go to the main purpose last. So this one, information in lines 57 through 64 primarily functions to what? So we've got 57 through 64. Okay, so let's go back to those. We want to functions to is kind of like why. So the summary of 57 through 64 is it talks a little bit about like logistics of the disease. This talks about how it's actually working with yellow and red. The virus works in particular suppressing. So it's a little bit of an overview. So primarily functions to, we want to go vague. That's kind of my key thing that I'm looking for. So describe the range of potential tulip colors, explain how the color variation in a broken tulip occurs, argue that yellow and red are only natural, and then indicate why broken tulips contain no A. Okay, so this one, describe the range. So let's kind of truth check these. So if it's describing the range of all the colors, I would say no on that one because it's just talking about yellow and white. So explain how the color variation occurs, maybe. Indicates why or indicate why broken tulips contain no A. Actually consists of 2 pigments. So that wouldn't be a primary person. It features it, but I would eliminate it because it's not primary. And then explain how the color variation of broken tulip. We talk about argue that yellow and white are the only natural tulip colors. So this one, the purpose of this paragraph is not to argue. So the answer is B. Okay, and then number 12, it can be reasonably inferred from the passage that some 17th century tulip growers believed tulip breaks were mainly caused by. So this one, we've got to go find it. So this is what's going on, the belief. So Dutch growers are talking about the 17th century, borrowing their techniques from alchemists, faced the comparable challenge over the earth above a bed planted with white tulips. Gardeners would liberally sprinkle paint powders and desired hue on theory, and rainwater would change the colors. Okay, they also sold magic to produce the colors. Their recipes produce magic color breaks. Yeah, so it was a lot on what they did to grow the plants. So that's kind of what their theory was, which makes sense for the time. Okay, so supplier storage conditions, that's not mentioned. Diseased tulip buds, no, it is stated that they could not have known. certain growing techniques, and then certain weather patterns. So since it's talking about sprinkling paint, this one is definitely not weather patterns, and this one's H. Okay, and then the main points of lines, or the second paragraph, main point, you want to go vague if possible. So let's go to that paragraph. So what's happening in that paragraph is, in general, they're talking about Rembrandt's paintings, but they're also talking about how like beautifully he painted the tulips, how wonderful they are, how today's tulips are kind of ugly, and the most striking examples, the fiery carmine, that Semper Augustus splash. So just talking about like how beautiful it is. And then Rembrandt's paintings have been painted by many of today's favorite artists. Compared to the 17th century Burgundy tulips, today's multicolored tulips are less visually appealing. That one sounds the best. The tulip break, known as Semper Augustus, was a striking example of, no, that one's an example. So whenever you see the word example and like main point, purpose, you just want to eliminate it. And then Rembrandt was responsible for painting the most famous tulip breaks of his time. And then, so that one's like a random fact. So this is what you're going for, the more general vague option. Okay, last question. So number 10, let me see if I can scroll down, is the main purpose of this passage is to. So let's look at the verbs highlight, examine, provide, and explain. Highlight changes in the flower industry from the 17th century to today. Ugh, that one I don't love. Examine the way certain plants have been represented in art over the centuries. No, that one's sometimes I mark little things on it, and then you have to always go back and look. And then H, provide an overview of plant viruses and the way they affect the flower market. Maybe, but that's really general, and this was talking about one particular plant. And then J, explain a particular flower variation and how it has been perceived historically. So this one, because it's talking about tulips, is
if you are looking for more support on your ACT reading or in general on your ACT, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, but also check out the links below how you can work with us.